Welcome again, and we have a lot to go through this evening as we continue to talk about the art of the prenup and legacy planning. And we're going to be going through some really important pieces for you. Please use the chat, as Judy mentioned, if you have any questions. If we can get them in, trust me, we will. If not, we will follow up with you with your answer. We want to make sure that this is as helpful for you as possible. So we're going to actually just go ahead and dive in. And, Julia, I'm going to go straight to you. Tell me, what actually is a prenup? What's in a prenup?
Yes.
And what does it stand for?
Yeah, so a prenup, also called a prenuptial agreement or premarital agreement, is the legal contract that is created between two people who plan to marry, covering how their property will be managed, including, what property is separate, what's marital, or community, depending on what state you're in, how future inheritance may be handled, a business, if you have a business. But it's important to keep in mind, a prenup does not go into effect until you get married. And you have to get a prenup before you get married. You cannot get a prenup after you get married.
And so what is, I'm going to go off script here, but if you are married and you want more financial clarity in your marriage, what would that look like? And what would that be?
Yeah, so that would be called a postnuptial agreement. Postnups are valid in most states. They are more highly scrutinized than prenuptial agreements because they're created and entered into after marriage. And there are oftentimes more requirements for a valid postnup. They're not as readily enforced as prenups are, although again, that varies greatly state to state.
And the people that most can benefit from a prenup, what does that look like? Because I have to say, Julia, I think that there's a misconception that it's, only the Britney Spears and the celebrities out there that have, millions and millions and millions of dollars. But I know, Julia, there are a lot of other people that can also really benefit from a prenup.
Yeah, I think anyone getting married should get a prenup. I mean, I really mean it. So first-time marriages, women who have their own businesses, second marriages, anyone with assets to protect for children. But going back to women, I think really particularly women can benefit from prenups. So that's women who are high earners in their relationships. They need prenups to protect their assets. Women who are business owners need a prenup to protect those business interests. Women who plan to be stay-at-home moms need prenups, as we will learn more about tonight, because they can really negotiate a financial arrangement that's more beneficial to them than even maybe state law would be. And typically when we think about prenups, we're thinking, someone who has a lot more money and someone who has no money, and we're protecting the wealthier person. That does not have to be the case. And I'm always kind of preaching this fact that prenups can really be protective to the less wealthy party, but also to women who in relationships are more vulnerable.
And if you're getting married for a second time, maybe you have children from your previous marriage, you're marrying someone, they could have children from a previous marriage too. What are the things that you need to think about in that case?
So I'm going to take that for you, Stacy. And what you would normally be thinking about are a couple of things. Number one, how to protect the property that you just actually acquired from your last marriage. So that will be your separate property, and you want to make sure that you provided for it, that you've set it forth in some sort of schedule, that you keep it separate and apart, but that you make sure that that property is protected. You've probably spent a good amount of time and perhaps money actually making sure that you got that property. So let's not give it up in the second marriage. That's number one. The other thing to think about if people are getting married for a second time is, are there obligations in terms of child support, alimony, and equitable distribution that one of or both of you will have, and how will that get paid? Is it going to get paid from separate property? Is it going to be paid from marital income? These are all questions that have to be dealt with. And one other thing that's important to think about is also, if you are getting married and you have another agreement with your ex-spouse, and perhaps that person was supposed to be paying you spousal support until the time you got remarried, you have to realize that now you're getting remarried, that spousal support will end. You need to make sure that as part of your prenup, you're protecting yourself. So you're now, you've left marriage one, you've got some sort of an arrangement perhaps for spousal support. Maybe it'll last, 10 years, 15 years, 5 years, but it ends upon your remarriage. You're now getting remarried. You don't want to be in a situation where you've left yourself open and not covered that. It may be a negotiation to have. Maybe there's some sort of somebody's going to take that on essentially as part of the prenuptial agreement, so that you don't lose out on that money that you fought so hard to have. So those are all part and parcel of this. You also should look, perhaps there are life insurance policies that one or both of you have already committed to and for your prior marriages, and perhaps you can't actually recommit to life insurance for your new spouse. There may be estate clauses where you've promised to give a portion of your estate to your children from your other marriage, from even your ex-spouse. These are all things that have to be considered when you're actually getting married for a second time or getting married to someone who has been married already.
Which is the norm of the families out there. I mean, it's not as much the case 25 years ago, but our traditional family is now a family that is typically, bringing in children from another marriage. And so these are a lot of things to think about. Back to the common trends. I'd love, Lisa, what are some of the trends you're seeing with prenups? We're talking about prenups more than I've ever seen in my career, which is great. But what are some of those trends that you're seeing?
So we are seeing more and more prenups where people come to us and they really want to keep their income and their assets separate. So, in New York State, for example, marriage is a financial partnership. And it used to be that we would see all these people who have joint accounts coming and during a divorce, they're breaking up their joint accounts. But we are seeing more and more now where people are coming to us and they want to make sure their income is separate, their partnership interest is separate, their professional, license is separate. Everything that they have is going to be separate, and perhaps they're going to have some joint account or joint assets that they're going to specify. So everything, for example, in a joint account will become joint and maybe split in a 50-50 manner, for example. But if it's in my account, in my name, it's going to be mine. And that is a trend that we're seeing more and more of, where there is just not this pooling of money, that people, maybe their parents have gone through divorces or their friends have gone through divorces, and they want to make sure that, they know that what they earn is what they're going to have.
Yeah.
And I just like to add on to that. I have some stats that kind of support everything Lisa's saying. We love our data at Hello Prenup. So about 70% of our users, and I think this is a trend, it shows quite a national trend because we're in 32 states. So 70% of them want to keep separate property separate while they're married. So exactly what Lisa said, including appreciation on that separate property. So as Lisa said, it's in my account, it's mine. Anything I earn on it remains mine. And then approximately 75% of Hello Prenup couples actually want to have a joint bank account. And I think the reason they want that one specific joint bank account is because they want everything else separate. So that's a really common and popular trend, I think, with millennials. And then the other trend that I've seen is infidelity clauses are becoming really popular. That's actually one of our major sources of traffic, is people are Googling, they're reading all about them. They're becoming more and more popular. I think there's a lot of curiosity around them because of celebrity prenups. But there was a recent Maryland case that came out that actually stated that an infidelity clause in a postnup should be upheld. And it was. And so I think we're going to start seeing more and more of that.
So I'm just going to jump into that, Julia, because my ears just perked up because what is an infidelity clause?
Yeah,
Tell me what that looks like.
Yeah, so an infidelity clause is a clause that says that if one party has an extramarital affair, they now have to pay some type of monetary amount. So, you know, in Hello Prenup's agreement, you can actually choose what that amount is. Oftentimes, some of the kind of pitfalls of this agreement are, you know, you have to prove it, which can be really hard to do. But these are becoming more and more popular as we see them in these celebrity agreements. And I think, I mean, I always say a prenup is just as much an emotional document as it is a legal document. And, you know, an infidelity clause is a really good example of that.
And I just posted to everyone in the chat, New York Times came out with a report, 15% of married women and 25% of married men have had affairs here in the US. So I can see why that is important. Lisa, back to the prenup, 100% makes sense. You know, you're coming to the marriage with assets. You want to protect those assets that you come to the marriage, the separate property, and potentially even the appreciation. Can prenups also address earnings during the marriage? Assets saved and earned from marital earnings, you know, during that time. So, and what does that look like? And then I have a follow-on on that, because the lesser moneyed spouse, I'll be quite frank, could truly really be screwed if they're coming to the marriage with no assets, and then the breadwinning partner, and that person is the non-breadwinning, you know, possibly even stay at home. If there's a prenup in place that's protecting the breadwinner to actually keep those marital earnings separate as well.
So this is exactly the trend we're seeing. I earn the money during the marriage. I keep my money. I keep it in my account. I don't put it into a joint account. If the marriage ends, it's my money, it's my asset, and you don't get, my spouse doesn't get that. That is exactly the trend that we're seeing. And you're right, it can really, it can be very difficult for the non-earning spouse. The difference, I think, is this, okay? And this is why I think that there is some element of fairness here, is that everyone knows going in that if it's in my name or if it's in your name, it's yours. And there's no dispute about it. And I know I have to go out to work if I want to have assets at the end of the marriage. And you know you have to go out to work if you want to have assets at the end of the marriage. Now, the issue comes when we have children and one of us wants to stay home. And therein lies the time, I think, that people go back and they either amend their prenup, or they renegotiate this issue, or they actually enter into a postnuptial agreement, providing for spousal support or some extra equitable distribution for the person who has decided to stay home, if that's what the agreement between the parties is, so that somebody doesn't get left behind, which is what we see for so many women. I mean, and I'm going to say women, right, who are out of the workforce, who are taking home care of the children, who have given up, you know, 10 or 15 or even 20 years of their career, and they cannot catch up to where their male spouses or other spouses were or are, right? They can provide for all of this in a prenup. So the answer is that, yes, I can keep my money, but if I want, you know, my partner to be staying home and supporting me, and so I can travel for my career, and I can actually, you know, wine and dine my clients and do all of those things, then I'm going to have to actually pay a price, and I'm going to literally pay that price in a prenup, and I'm going to make sure that it's there, or in a postnup later. And I think that that's what people should be doing and thinking about.
And we have a great question in the chat of, you know, can I protect my retirement accounts in a prenup? Yes, you can protect your retirement accounts, your brokerage account. You can protect a business, a commercial property, a piece of real estate, all of that. And the next section we're going to go into is we're going to talk about timing. When do you have the prenup conversation? But before we do, I want to jump over to you, Julia. A great question. What is the cost range for a prenup? That came through the chat. I think it's a really good, a good question, because I think that, again, this goes back to the myth that, you only the ultra wealthy can afford a prenup, and that's not the case. Is that right, Julia?
Yeah, so I would say generally across the country, prenups can range from $2,500 to, I mean, $20,000. I think California is on the higher end. But Hello Prenup is $599 to use our platform. So $599 per couple, which I think makes a prenup a lot more accessible to a lot more people. And you can also, if you do want attorney, I think there is a lot of value to having legal advice and attorney representation if you have questions or concerns or want edits. And so one of the great things about our agreements is that you can actually bring it to an attorney to edit as a Word document.
That's fantastic. And just a question back to you, Lisa. What are agreements that individuals can potentially have that are not going to get married? Is that considered what's called a cohabitation agreement?
So it can be a cohabitation agreement. It's a contractual agreement. So it's going to be in the form of a contract, and it's not going to be due to a marriage, obviously, but we have done actually domestic partnerships and those contractual agreements where someone agrees, for example, to provide, a portion of a residence because both of you are putting money in or not, or you're on title, or you've opened up a joint bank account and you each get. So there are ways to deal with this, or I'm going to pay you a certain amount of money. There's tax issues though involved in all of this, right? So keep in mind that when you are married and we equitably divide up the property, or even in community property, although the assets could be taxed for various reasons, the actual transfer is usually tax-free. That might not be the case if you aren't married. So we have to always look at that piece of it.
Really important, really important. And yes, so transfer subject to a divorce or legal separation for a married couple, typically tax-free, but not necessarily the case if you are not married. So a few things to think about. I'm going to shift to timing because this actually goes into and helps answer a question that came in the chat that I thought was a fantastic question of, can a prenup be revoked or put aside, whatever word you want to use there? And so we're going to answer some of that, but let's talk about timing first, Julia. When's the best time to have that prenup conversation with your soon-to-be spouse?
Yeah, I would say as soon as possible. I know I sound a little bit crazy when I say have the conversation before you get engaged, but I mean that because I think before you get engaged, if you're in a serious relationship, you're probably talking about money. Maybe you live together, maybe you're splitting bills. But if you're talking about money and you're serious about moving forward with this relationship, you should be talking about a prenup. And the reason I think you should be talking about it prior to getting engaged is because you don't necessarily want to spring this on your partner at the last minute. And what I see is a lot of people get engaged and they're in that kind of like honeymoon phase of engagement, planning the wedding, telling people about it. It feels like something new. And they just keep putting off the conversation. They put it off, put it off, put it off. Oh my God, we're a month before the wedding. We don't have a prenup. This is something that's important to me. And now you're springing it on your spouse or future spouse who maybe did not have that in mind. And you're not giving yourselves either enough time to really let it sink in and negotiate and talk about what it means. Or even if you have enough time to complete it, you may not have enough time to get your legal questions answered or engage lawyers if that's something that's important to you. So timing is key. Give yourself as much time as possible and do not wait until a month before your wedding.
Yes, and that actually can go into concerns and a challenge. And Lisa, I'd love for you to jump in on this. I know that you've had cases where you've been successfully able to fight for the prenup that your spouse has signed to not be upheld. Can that be because of timing?
So timing isn't usually going to be the issue. I'm going to say that and that's really important for people to know. because I think that these agreements that get negotiated literally as people are going down the going down the aisle, and
Yeah.
I've had some of those, right? And we literally are at the somebody's at the rehearsal dinner and has to come back from the rehearsal dinner to sign the prenup.
Are you
Because
kidding me?
I'm not. I will tell you, we literally had this, and I had one of my partners who was in the office, and she called the other attorney and she said, where is your client? We're ready to sign, and tomorrow's the wedding. And the attorney said, well, why don't we just meet at the Pierre tomorrow to sign it? And she said, no, we're not doing that. We're signing tonight. And he said, well, he's at the rehearsal dinner. Well, she's here in my office. So everybody had to leave the rehearsal dinner to actually sign the prenup. It's insane how close it gets. So, I think that this idea that and in some states there is a time period. Julia and I have talked about this, because there was legislation at some point in New York that said, which they tried to pass, which said you had to sign your prenup in advance of the wedding by so much time. We don't have that in New York. There may be some states that do have that. Julia might know that. But bottom line is, that's not going to probably be the reason, nor is it going to be that you were really upset, or that you sent out the invitations, or that your mother had come in from California and your whole family was waiting. The only reasons usually that prenups will get set aside is the unconscionability. It has to so be unfair that it's going to shock the conscience. And I'm going to tell you, there's not a lot that shocks the conscience in what we do. So
I think we've watched too many reality TV shows now. Nothing shocks us.
Exactly.
I think
so
that's
you
the
have
problem.
to be super careful about what you're going to sign, and make sure that you're very thoughtful about it.
Yeah, and actually, when you say super careful, making sure that you have an attorney review it, right?
That would be my feeling. I know that, Julia, you have people who obviously do it on their own. And so, I'm going to hand it over to you to explain that.
Yeah, and I just want to kind of back up to the timing. So this goes hand in hand with the attorney conversation. In California, there has to be 7 days between the final version of the prenuptial agreement and signing it, right? So ostensibly, if you're going to sign it on the day of your wedding, you need to have at least 7 days. It has to be finalized at least 7 days prior. Also in California, there are certain clauses that for example, if you want to waive alimony, or rather spousal support in California, then the party who is waiving that right needs to be represented by an attorney at the time they signed the agreement. So there are timing requirements in certain states. I know New Hampshire is another one. The agreement has to be signed and finished, or finished and signed 30 days prior to the wedding. So different states have different rules. And similarly, I think the level of scrutiny applied when there is not an attorney involved also varies. In Massachusetts, it's something that will be considered whether or not the parties had the opportunity and the time to consult with an attorney and chose not to. In California, if they do not hire an attorney, even if they choose not to waive spousal support, there needs to be a waiver in the agreement saying that they understand that they had the time to hire an attorney and chose not to. So I think it really depends state by state. Generally speaking, I would say, there is no hard and fast rule that you have to have a lawyer in order to get a prenuptial agreement. And in fact, it's important to understand that, because I think there's a misconception that without an attorney, you can't get a prenup. And then a lot of people forfeit the important right to get one. But I do think that it can be really helpful. It can be a wonderful tool to ensure that your specific situation is being accounted for, your legal questions are being answered, and especially if you're going into the marriage with significant assets, it can be helpful to walk into an attorney's office with a full draft and say, okay, I need help protecting X, Y, or Z. Does this agreement do this? And if not, how can we make that happen? Because it's more of a custom solution.
So important, and it goes right into our next section of the panel, which is talking about why are prenups in particular even that much more important for women. And Lisa, do you want to jump in first on that?
Sure. So I'll say this. I think that there's a lot of misconception about the fact that women shouldn't sign prenups, that it's always bad for the women when they sign prenups. I don't think that's true. I think it's about negotiation. And I think that particularly if you're going to be out of the workforce for a period of time, and you maybe, want to stay home with children or raise children, et cetera, or support your spouse, you need the prenup to actually protect you on the other end. Because without that prenup, you might not actually get the spousal support that you deserve and should get. Because I'm going to say this, the courts are not that kind these days when it comes to spousal support. And you might not even get the equitable distribution that you should get, because it may be that your spouse is the one who has the business, your spouse is the one who's going in every day to the business. And I will say, for example, in New York, when we value businesses, the spouse does not get 50% of the business. Spouse may get anywhere from 20 to maybe 30 or 35% of the value of a business. So these are all things that could be negotiated in your prenup. And so for a woman, it's very important. If you are the breadwinner, okay, and I'm going to say this again, if you're the breadwinner and you are female, you likely will also be taking on the primary role as a parent, which means you're doing double time. And we see this all the time. You're the one who may be organizing the childcare, organizing the activities, organizing all of this stuff. And so you want to make sure that you've protected all of your assets, all of your income at the same time, so that you don't end up on the wrong end paying spousal support or a larger piece of equitable distribution that you should be paying. So there's so many reasons as a woman to make sure that you are negotiating a great prenup. And Lauren, I think you've experienced this, so I'm going to kind of turn it over to you.
Yeah, Lauren, I'd love you to chime in and also just take a break here. So I just put some great information in the chat. I just want you to all encourage you to go to Hello PreNup. A lot of this information that I'm sharing in the chat is actually from their website. They have fantastic blogs that really cover everything you could possibly ever want to know about a prenup. So just again, please to do that. I'll go and also include in our chat their website that you can do that. But know that a lot of this content, I'm going to try and source as much as I can, but I'm doing multitasking a little bit here with the chat, with moderating, and then of course I have a really beautiful cup of coffee. No judgments to any of you. I've had a big day. I was up early, but I'll put that in the chat too. So go to their website too, because there's a huge amount of content there. But kicking it over to you, Lauren.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Yeah, everything Lisa just said is true, and I am walking proof of it. So to give you a little backstory on who I am and how I got involved with Hello PreNup, I got engaged to a high-earning man, and I was a working, single woman who had a modest, bank account and big dreams and goals, marrying a high net worth man. And very early on, he asked me, are you open to a prenup? And I said, absolutely. Like, I'm here for the love. I am not here for your money. And I'm going to prove it to you in a prenup. And we went through a traditional attorney process where I hired a divorce attorney. He hires a divorce attorney, and I'm looking at my beautiful new rock, and it feels very awkward and weird. And they basically serve a draft to me that says, you will not get alimony or spousal support, even if you stay home and raise the kids. You will, even if you quit your job and you lose out for every year that you stay home and raise the kids, there will not be any lump sum payments or anything to take care of you. And all of that actually came to fruition. So I ended up marrying this man. I stayed home to raise my son during the pandemic. It didn't work out, and I am now going through a divorce from this man. And what I wish I would have done is I wish I would have gone back in time and negotiated for my future self, and really understood that a prenup is an agreement. It is not something that a higher earning person serves to a lesser earning person. It is an agreement between two people to get you to literally be on the same page about what your goals are for marriage, including your finances. And as a woman, I think it's extremely crucial to think about not just who you are and what you have to offer in the marriage today, but what you're possibly going to offer in the marriage in a few years, in 10 years from now, and in the event that it just doesn't work out. Because far too many women enter into an agreement thinking they're never going to get divorced, this is never going to happen to me, and then they stayed home, raised a couple kids, and then the marriage doesn't work out, and they are left to continue to raise these kids, re-enter the workforce, and have to go back to work. And that's literally what happened to me. So I stayed home with my son. I saw that Hello PreNup existed, and I was like, oh my God, I wish I had this service, because it walks you through and educates you why a prenup is so powerful for not just the higher earning spouse, the one that wants to protect everything, but for the lesser earning spouse who really needs to think about what might happen in the event that it just doesn't work out, and you don't have alimony to get you back on your feet and enter the workforce, and you don't have anybody literally to help you with all of the labor that's involved with getting a new house, raising these kids, like re-entering the workforce. And so for me, I believe that prenups are especially important for women, because the data shows women naturally have more life events that we go through that we need to protect. And it's really important that we speak our piece when we enter into this marriage and say, you know, if you think I'm worth it and you think this marriage is worth it, you will consider things like a lump sum payment if I leave my job. For every year I leave my job, you know, I will get this payment or whatever. And vice versa. You know, if you are the higher earning spouse and you are the one that might potentially have to pay out alimony in the future, we are seeing that trend on the rise more and more. And a lot of men, I saw this story in the comment, it's these men don't want to get divorced. Why? Because they don't want to leave the breadwinner anymore. They can't for their ego, and they don't want to re-enter into the dating pool. So they stay into these marriages. And for those of them that do leave, the women are paying alimony, and they're paying the tuition for their kids to go to college, and they're just trying to get back into the dating world and hope they don't find another guy that takes half their stuff. So at minimum, women really need to think about it, because we have so much to offer. There's so many amazing things that are going to happen to us in this life, and you really want to protect yourself at every single life milestone that you go through.
And this is really important. I'm just sharing some statistics from Pew Research Center. 1 in 5 moms are stay-at-home parents. And we know that that also doesn't include the number of women who step out of the workforce for a little bit and then step back. But those years that they've stepped out, their earning capacity has been decimated, right? And for every year that you are out, you can definitely get back in, but it's a long road for you to get back to that number you had when you stepped out. Lisa, let's say there's a woman listening to this wonderful panel right now, and I'm not going to swear because I'm going to be, but just you guys just think about the words I'm saying in my mind. She's saying this to herself right now. I have just signed something that I shouldn't have signed. What can she do? What can she do now that she is married and she signed this?
So I think it depends where she is in the process and what she has signed, obviously. But
Yeah,
I think she needs to go back to her now spouse and say, this is really unfair. I can't stay in this marriage with this particular agreement, because I'm going to end up possibly with very little to nothing. And I can't be here, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now in that situation. Or that person has to go out and really develop a strong career. That's choice too, right? And I think people don't necessarily think about that as a choice until they get to the end. And then they find out, okay, there was nothing in the prenup for me and I didn't build the career. And frankly, the prenup is a roadmap. So you can either have it modified, enter into a postnup, or say to your spouse, you know what? I got to go out and work and build my career, and I can't worry so much about you, okay? Or even everything else that we're doing. I have to make sure that I'm taking care of me, or you need to actually come to the table so that what we have together is fair if there is an end. Because I think what happens is people never plan for the day that they unfortunately might get served with the divorce papers, and they need to plan now.
It's interesting. I just had a conversation about this with a woman. They're not going through a divorce process, but she is very seriously thinking about it. And about a year ago, she shared how financially insecure she felt because she is not the earner, has raised her children, one of her children a special needs child. And so the husband said, okay, I'm going to transfer, $2.5 million to your account. It's separate property. And if we get divorced, that is yours. And for her, it gave her a lot of clarity. Now, the problem is that he's still an absolute blank hole, a-hole. So you can remember, kind of fill in the blanks there. But, for her, though, she feels like she's in such a better place. Now, granted, maybe she could have gotten more, right? But for her, she at least feels like there's something in my name and what I signed before that I, as draconian as it is, at least I have this to go forward. And letting you all know that the recording will be made available. So don't worry, anyone that registered for our event this evening, this recording we will be sure to send out to you and that you have access to this. I want to just pivot a little bit to starting the conversation. And Lisa, I'm going to have you take over this part of the panel as the moderator of, how can you start the conversation? And I'm just going to share in true authenticity. I started the conversation with my husband about a PreNup. FY, he's the best guy in the world. We've been together 22 years. He's awesome. But what has happened in our marriage, we're both extremely successful, but I now have a business. I've built this business during our marriage. The value of our business, of my business that I've built, is worth twice as much as all of our other assets combined. And so what I said to him is, it's not that I don't want you to have part of the business, because he has supported me. Oh my gosh. When I was the lowest paid employee, when we had to pay our employees out of our own pocket. This is being recorded, so I'm sure he could use this against me. I know what you're thinking there, Lisa. He could use this against me, but we're very happy, thank God. But my concern was I'm going to be living in my office of my business on the couch, and you're going to have so much more in assets. I'm going to be starting from scratch, and I don't want to sell my business. I don't want to put my employees in a place where I'm doing a fire sale. And we started that conversation after I finally got the courage after 4 glasses of wine. Okay, can I just tell you, that's not how you start that decision, okay, or that conversation. So let's talk about, Lisa, if you want to jump into this, and I know you have some thoughts, and Lauren and Julia have some thoughts too, about when is the best time and how to start this well, I guess not the best time, we talked about that, but how to start this conversation, because at least for me, I was being a total coward. It took me 4 glass. My courage was alcohol induced. That's not ideal, right?
So, Lauren, I guess you're the person to ask this question, right? Because we see people after the conversation has somewhat started. And whether it started because the person was handed the prenup and there was no notice and here's your prenup, or it's an ongoing conversation. What are your thoughts about how to start this conversation with your soon-to-be spouse?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer it from a couple different angles. If you are the person that wants the prenup and you want to bring it up to your partner, I think the best way to do it is to play to their strengths. And what I mean to that is if you know that Mondays are the worst day of the week for them, they've been in meetings all day, they're tired, that's the last thing. Don't talk to them on Mondays. Pick the time that your partner is going to be receptive to this conversation. And when you are ready to bring it up and the mood is right, I would lead with the value of why you even want this prenup. Forget money, forget like we could possibly get divorced, forget all that. I think the top question you should ask is, what do we both need to feel safe and comfortable in this marriage? Because that's really what a prenup is. It's an agreement between two people that this is the roadmap. I like your word, Lisa. It's a roadmap of where we're going to go and why we're getting married. And so I would sit down with your partner. Wine is totally encouraged, Stacey. Like, I'm here for that. Pour a glass of wine and say to your partner, why are we getting married? And what do you need to feel safe at night that this marriage is going to work out? Because that's why people put separate property aside. That is why people do joint accounts. It's because they want to know at the end of the day, I'm going to feel safe and totally comfortable in this marriage, and that I don't have to worry about what's in the future. Because if we can talk about all this now and get on the same page, we won't get divorced, right? Because we had this conversation now and we know exactly where we're headed and we're literally on the same page. So I would keep it value-based. I wouldn't come forward and just say, hey, what do you think about a prenup? Because that is a little bit hairy and scary. People already have a bias towards that conversation. And if you're not sure where they stand on prenups in general, I would zoom way out and just say, what do you need to feel safe in this marriage? Let's draft it in an agreement. If you are the person that is going to be asked about the prenup. So I like going back in time, I'm me and I have my ex-husband here and he asked me the question. He did exactly what I said not to do. We were driving in a car, we were on a date, and he looks at me super casual and he goes, so what do you think about a prenup? That situation was forcing me to say, I'm totally comfortable with it. We're on date 3. I want to impress this man, right? Like, I'm just saying whatever, whenever, to just be like, yeah, he's not serious, right? Lo and behold, a month later, we hired divorce attorneys. But anyway, the point of that is, if you are on the receiving end, I would go back to the person that's asking you and say, why is a prenup important to you? And then rebuild that conversation to, what is that going to help you sleep at night? If so, is a prenup really the thing that we need to do? Or is it a further conversation through counseling? Do you have trust issues? Do you have parents that were divorced and you're scared of all these things? Let's get to the root of why you feel like you need to protect things from me, because that at the end of the day, all roads will lead to, this is what I need to feel safe in this marriage. And you're exponentially increasing the value of your marriage, and that it will inevitably work out and you don't even need a prenup anyways.
Right. And I want to jump over to Amy and introduce Amy Holzman. So Amy Holzman is an expert in this area, and obviously introduced an expert also in trust and estate work, and is my own personal attorney. So I feel very safe, because if God forbid something happens to me, I know my kids are going to be absolutely taken care of, and the rest of my family as well. So keeping it over to you, what are your thoughts? What is your experience in recommending of how you start these conversations too, and why a prenup is important, Amy?
Well, a prenup is not only important because people do tend to think about it, I'm getting divorced, I need a prenup, but there's a very large component of, one day we will all not be here. And your spouses have rights, probably in every single state in the United States, to your assets at death. And so if you want to change what those presumptions are under the law, including what you might inherit or be gifted from your parents, you need to recognize that. So in a very bizarre situation, if you have a bad honeymoon and you come back 2 weeks later and get divorced, it's unlikely your spouse is getting anything or very little. If you have an even worse honeymoon and you die, in the state of New York, they're getting quite a lot. So you better make sure that's what you intend. And if you don't intend that, you can absolutely contract that out. And if you're going to, you can go from getting nothing to making sure there's a trust for your spouse, making sure there's housing for your spouse, making sure that you have the ability, if you have children, to provide for children, because you wouldn't want to say 100% goes to spouse in most instances. And the other thing that people really need to be careful about is, transmutation, which is changing character. So people don't realize, I heard a lot of people today say, that people want to come into a marriage and protect these assets and protect the appreciation on these assets. But these assets can shift around. We all know we have one asset, we buy something else, we do something else, when we start putting them together with our spouse, we commingle assets. So you really need to be careful, and from a trust and estates point of view, to protect those assets as well. And we see a lot of people doing a trust, I'm going to say a prenup trust combo, meaning you have separate assets, and if you put them in the wrapper of a trust, then we know where they are. We don't have to go back and look later, whether someone's getting divorced, whether somebody dies, what were premarital assets. Here they are, they were put in a trust, whatever they turned into, we can still identify them. They have a separate name to them. So, I'm going to agree that, the honest conversation of not just whatever assets you may have, but if your family has assets, do you think you should be inheriting my parents' assets? I've actually had clients who say that they've been engaged and someone said, absolutely yes. And then they've said, well, maybe we shouldn't get married. Like, if you think you're entitled to my parents' assets, that's quite a conversation. So I do think these very open conversations are important, because you don't want to be losing not only assets that you may have earned, but assets that you may receive.
So, Amy, that brings up the other piece of this, right? Which is that the parents or the family who have earned the assets and built these estates, essentially, that when they are going to be giving over, either in death or during their lifetime, gifts to their adult children, they may want those assets protected. And they may be asking their children to actually, their adult children, right, to get these prenups. What conversations do you have with the families in general about this? Because essentially it's legacy planning, right?
Absolutely. So I bring this up actually with all of my clients, because even if I am dealing with like a wonderfully happily married client who they've been married for however many decades, I say to them, it's their business whether they have a prenup, don't have a prenup. But if one of them is going to die, which one of them is going to die, actually both of them are going to die, probably not together, they should know that they're risking all of their assets at that point. Because if the other one gets remarried and cuts out children, you can unintentionally cut out your children when you get remarried. So that's the first line of conversation. The other line of conversation I think you're speaking to, Lisa, is when I have clients who are going to do big gifting, or they are wealthy clients, it's going down to their kids. I tell them to have the conversation with their kids. They're more than welcome to blame me for it. But really the conversation is, I'm not telling you how to run your marriage or financially run your marriage. You do whatever you want to do, you negotiate whatever you want to negotiate, or you leave it completely blank. You can actually do a prenuptial agreement that only covers gifted and inherited assets during divorce and at death. And I have many, many, many of those prenuptial agreements. And
when as a parent, do you have that conversation with your child, even, or your adult child? When is the time to start having that conversation?
I think that time is fairly soon. I don't mean, when they're like reaching for their binky, but the conversation should be somewhere at least in their early 20s. In other words, it's a conversation about relationships, and you don't necessarily want to tell your children what you have, but it's a conversation about, whether they're going to work, as we've talked about, if they're staying home, having that protection, and telling them that they need to, most people do know if they come from some sort of wealth, and just a conversation about protecting wealth. It's an easier conversation to have when they don't bring home their first boyfriend, girlfriend, or whatever friend. Okay, that's a hard time to have a conversation after their new partner has come to family dinner. Is like, let's talk about the prenup, because then it becomes about that person. And that's very difficult. So it's
so Amy, I'm thinking this is perfect timing. So Sebastian just went on his second date. He's 16. So I know exactly what this conversation is going to be tonight at dinner when we have our Chinese, and he'll be in a good mood because we got sushi. So that's good. We're going to bring this up. And she's lovely, but I was like, oh my gosh, now I'm thinking about this for my child. Maybe it's because of this panel, but yeah, obviously, second date material, but better to have the conversation now versus,
a while, Stacy.
Exactly. I know, but I'm a planner.
I do.
So the other thing that you mentioned in terms of death, okay, is that somebody could inherit monies, okay, from their spouse due to one of their spouses dying inadvertently. I mean, if they don't fix this in some sort of a document, right, either a will or other ways. So talk about that a little bit,
Right.
Amy.
So let's be very clear. If you think you're going to avoid your spouse inheriting by doing a will or trust and leaving them out, that is not what the state law has in plan for you. So that is not the answer. There is no will, no trust, no special document that I can draft that's going to avoid your spouse inheriting unless you do prenup, postnup, waiver of right of election. You need to have, your spouse needs to agree to this. You cannot unilaterally cut out your spouse. So it is a conversation. There's nothing sneaky you can do. You really need to make sure you're having these conversations. I mean, I'm going to say, especially if you have children or other family members that are relying on you, because if your spouse is getting a big chunk of your wealth and you mean it to go to other people, and it's not a contest, it's just by what the law provides. So you definitely want to be having these conversations, and you definitely want to be putting these provisions into your prenuptial agreements.
And Amy, do you see, when I draft prenups, we draft often for what happens if there's no children versus if there are children. Do you do that when you're drafting prenups as well?
Absolutely. So go on your follow-up.
And what are some of the differences of how you might draft it?
So, and some of this is children, no children, and longevity. So there's a difference between I'm married for 5 minutes or 5 years without children, and I'm married for, it could be 1 year with a child or 20 years without a child. But you really want to make sure that I'm going to say the non-moneyed spouse has a place to live, can afford to live in that place. You know, I've seen provisions where a very swanky house is provided for, that there's no way that spouse, it's going to go on the market the next day. There's no way that spouse can afford it. Everyone's going to have to move out. So you want to provide for that spouse. And while a prenuptial agreement cannot provide for any kind of child support, you still want that spouse to be living comfortably if there are children. And people don't generally think about, they think about owning property, like I own half, you own half, but you can actually leave your spouse property. We call it a marital trust. And you can leave your spouse your property for them to use during their life. And when they die, it goes back to children, or your children and not their next children. You can own property and set up trust that way. And you can require that in a prenuptial agreement. So there are more options than people think. You know, you can actually have your cake and eat it too. You can provide for a spouse and guarantee that the money goes to somebody else after your spouse isn't alive.
And not necessarily to their new spouse. That's the key, right?
Positively not to go to their new spouse. Also, I mean, there are a number of tax considerations as well as using exemption, or who's going to be trustees, or who's going to be executors. There are lots of different roles that people don't tend to think about that you want to be putting in your documents, because at the end of the day, there are state rights. And if you're not thinking about them in advance, and you're only thinking about, oh, if there's a divorce, there could be perfectly lovely marriage, but something goes awry in the death scenario.
So Amy, you're a trust and estates attorney, you draft prenups. I am a matrimonial attorney, as is Julia, and we draft prenups. What do people do? Do they go to a trust and estates attorney? Do they go to a matrimonial attorney? Talk about that a little bit, because I think sometimes people don't know necessarily where to go to get their prenuptial agreement.
So I'm going to say not every trust and estates attorney has experience drafting a prenup. And I would assume that any trust and estates attorney, and I would hope, who doesn't do this on a very regular basis would say, no, thank you. That's not what I do. The same thing if someone slipped and fell, we wouldn't go, oh, I think I'll try to take on that law as well. But there are a number of trust and estates attorneys who are well equipped to do this, as well as matrimonial attorneys. I'm going to say, so the best of both worlds. I mean, Lisa and I will work together, which is a combination of having both attorneys. Now, when Lisa and I sort of work under the same heading, when we represent people, which is a great advantage to our clients, I've been involved in prenuptial agreements where there are 4 attorneys. There are 2 matrimonial attorneys, there are 2 trust and estates attorneys. And that's a whole lot of attorneys, from different firms. That's a lot of attorneys, as opposed to, when we do it together under the same heading. But you really do want somebody who knows what happens, what are your rights if you're divorced, what are the problems if you're divorced, and you really want someone who knows all of the taxes and all of the special provisions that we can put in on the trust and estates end. Because if you're not seeing the consequences, you're drafting in a vacuum.
Mhm.
And I will say, I've had the experience, and Amy and I have discussed this. I had the experience of where a trust and estates attorney is on the other side of the prenup, and here I am, a matrimonial attorney, and I don't necessarily understand the language. And so I brought in trust and estates attorneys to work together, like I do with Amy. And the trust and estates attorney in that case did not bring in a matrimonial attorney, and so had no idea what the statutory requirements were. And it was a disaster, frankly, for the other side. At the end of the day, they did get divorced, and it was a complete disaster. So I think if there is a trust and estates attorney on the other side, and you've hired a matrimonial attorney, let your matrimonial attorney get the advice from a trust and estates attorney as well, and vice versa. Don't limit yourself. This is a document that is probably going to last probably through your marriage. Okay. You may never pick it up. You may never look at it again. It may be in some drawer or file. By the way, keep it safe, because I will say the very first case I had that involved a prenup, the prenup disappeared coincidentally as the woman went into the hospital. It just disappeared from her drawer where she was. So you want to make sure it's kept really safe. And we have a couple of questions in the chat, but I just want to ask Julia one question, because we're ending shortly, and I want to understand what a sunset clause is, Julia, because I bet everybody would like to know that. You're on mute.
Oh, sorry about that. One of my favorite clauses is the sunset clause. So it is a clause that states at a certain date, it can be an anniversary or a date that is meaningful to you, or a certain number of years that you've been married, rather, that states at that point, the prenup is null and void and ceases to exist. And the reason a sunset clause can be really beneficial to some couples is, in some ways, it's a negotiating chip. So if one party feels like, unsure about maybe the prenup in general, the sunset clause can put their mind at ease by saying, you know what, if we've been married 20 years, at that point, the prenup doesn't matter to me anymore. We've worked for everything we've had in the last 20 years together. So the prenup can cease to exist, and the property can be incorporated into the marital estate as it would without a prenup.
So one of the questions is, can debt acquired during the marriage be kept separate also through a prenup? And I can answer that. The answer is definitely yes. We do this all the time. For example, school loans might be debt that someone is coming into a marriage with, and you don't necessarily, as the person who doesn't have the school loan, you don't necessarily want to take on that burden. Many times we specifically state that each person's school loans will be their own separate debt, paid from their own separate property, however that is defined in the agreement. Somebody might come in with great credit card debt. That is also a good reason to have a prenup, so that you don't take on somebody else's credit card debt. And we've already talked about, alimony, spousal support from a prior marriage, that's debt. It's an obligation. Payments of equitable distribution to a prior spouse, that's debt. Child support, or payments for college, all of that is debt that your soon-to-be spouse may be coming in with and may be burdened with, and you don't necessarily want that burden. Then you need to specifically say it, because the law, and I will tell you in New York State, is they're not going to sort this all out for you later. I promise you, they will not do that, because there is case law that says they are not doing that. So if you don't specify it, you may be paying it. Go ahead, Amy.
I'm going to talk about prospective debt, which is tax liability. So you also absolutely want a clause in there, especially if you're not the moneyed spouse. You have a spouse who's earning a fortune, is in whatever businesses, joint ventures, you're signing a joint tax return. You are responsible. You do not want to be responsible. So you can really end up on the bad end of that deal of not making money and being responsible for that prospective debt, for that tax liability. So you absolutely want to have that in a prenuptial agreement as well.
Amy, taking that a step further with debt, one of the biggest breakups, breakups in relationships is because of money issues. And often we tend to marry people who are different than us. If you're getting married and you're the super financially responsible person, and you're marrying a spouse, a partner that has a very low credit score, going in with debt, you expect that they're going to accumulate more debt. What about that accumulating more debt during the marriage? Is there a way to protect against that?
Absolutely. You want to keep that separate. You want to, they're incurring.
So saying any additional debt accumulated during the marriage, it is their separate responsibility. Makes sense. Now, something that I do want to just say about that, if you are saying that, but you are a cosigner, or you are also on a credit card with that person, it doesn't matter what that prenup says, because Visa, MasterCard, American Express, they have great commercials, but they're not very nice when you owe them a lot of money, and they're going to come back after. They're going to come after you. It doesn't really matter what the prenup says. So that's
an agreement with them saying you'll pay. So
exactly. You've created that. I'm signing that credit card, and you don't look at all the minutia, because you need, not just glasses, but magnifying, glasses to read it. But that's what you've agreed to. So I know we are coming up to time. It's 7:15. We've had a phenomenal, great amount of questions. And I just want to say thank you to everyone for being here. Amy, Lisa, Julia, Lauren, you guys are fantastic. This absolutely just flew by. I know we could spend even more time, but know that this is going to be recorded, and we will send that out to all of you. I also want you to know that this is just the beginning of this fantastic panel. And so we have 3 more panels for you to be able to attend in the Get Divorce Savvy About Your Finances. We will follow up with all of you too with those additional dates, links that you can register. Please do share the information. Each one is different, and it's going to help you with everything from getting on your top of your finances to help during the divorce, to looking at finances afterwards. difficult situations when you don't know what the assets really are. We're going to be talking about all of these topics and more. I do want to give just a very important shout out to both Lauren and Julia of Hello PreNup for sponsoring our fantastic panel. We couldn't have done this without you. As you know, Savvy Ladies is a 501c3 nonprofit, and all the dollars that are donated go directly towards serving women. Just last year, we connected 2,500 women in need with certified financial planners, financial coaches, CPAs to work free of charge. And so if you know of anyone that can benefit from that, or anyone even on this call this evening, please do go to www.savvyladies.org. And remember, Savvy is spelled with 2 V's. Why? Because it's very, very good. So savvyladies.org. We hope you come to the helpline. There's also just a wealth of information on every single financial topic you could ever need to know about. And if you are a helping professional, a financial professional, I know we have quite a few of those wonderful people here with us tonight. We are always looking for more volunteers. We have over 180 volunteers, but we're always looking for more because already this month we surpassed and increased the number of women reaching out over 3 times versus this time last year. So we definitely need more support from our volunteers, and of course, always welcome to more women coming to the Savvy Ladies Helpline. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining. Wishing you a happy new year. And I'm so happy and proud that your first steps in this new year is taking care of yourself, investing in yourself, and making sure that you have a secure financial future. So thank you for being here.